As we exit one decade and we enter another decade, I thought about what could be the greatest thing for us to pursue as Christ followers. And I can't get anything more important than humility. You know why? Because Jesus was the one who said, "He who humbles himself, God will exalt. But the one who exalts himself, he will be humbled." The first thing I have to point out about that is that Jesus said, "He who humbles himself." Humbling myself, that responsibility of humbling myself falls upon me. I have to do that. Now, somebody can humiliate me, but only I can humble myself. Somebody can humiliate you, but only you can humble yourself before God. We see the Apostle Paul humbling himself consistently. And this is why God was able to exalt him the way he did. The Apostle Paul was by no means a carnal Christian, if there is such a thing as a carnal Christian. But the Apostle Paul at the end of Romans chapter 7 was the one who shouted, and he was totally exasperated when he said, "What a wretched man I am. Who can save me from this body of death?" He knew he needed God's mercy to be saved. We also see earlier in his ministry, this is 55 after Christ, in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 9, he says this, "For I am the least of all the apostles." 6 years later, in Ephesians 3 verse 8, he says, "Though I am the very least of all the saints." And then another 6 years later, he writes Timothy 1 verse 15, he says, "Among whom I am chief, which is of all the sinners." So we see that he says first, "I'm the least of all the apostles." Later on in his life, he says, "Actually, I'm the least of all the saints." And then finally, at the end of his ministry life, he says, "Actually, I'm the chief of all sinners." He had such a sober perspective of who he was in comparison to who God is. God's holiness in comparison to him, a sinner. And he knew that he needed God's mercy. And sometimes we forget that we are at the mercy of God. We are at his mercy. We need God's mercy on a daily basis. And that's why we're so blessed, because his mercies are new every day for us. You know, where Jesus said that he who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. That whole idea there was explained by Jesus within the context of the parable that he told. The parable was about the Pharisee and the tax collector. A Pharisee being a very moral individual, usually, and a tax collector usually being very immoral. They both went to go pray. The tax collector, of course, prayed differently than the Pharisee, because the Pharisee started by justifying himself. He started by exalting himself. He said, "I'm better than this, and thank God that I'm not a sinner like that, and thank God I'm not like that tax collector." He was exalting himself. And then he says, "And by the way, I give a tenth of everything that I earn, plus I fast twice a week." So he was exalting himself by listing all the great things that he does. And he was feeling better about himself as he compared himself to other people's sins. And that's how you exalt yourself. But the tax collector, Jesus said, "I tell you, this man," or he says in verse 13, he says, "But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his chest, saying, 'God, have mercy upon me.'" He was invoking the mercy of God. Jesus then says, "I tell you, this tax collector, he will go home justified before God, but the Pharisee will not. For all those who exalt themselves, like the Pharisee did, they will be humbled. But those who humble themselves will be exalted." Here's the question. You know that you are humbled when you are desperate for the mercy of God. One sign I know that is true of a person who humbles themselves before God is the way they come to scriptures. The proud person comes to the scriptures this way. He goes, "Well, let me see what kind of wisdom God has." And he wants to evaluate God by reading the word. The humble person does it the other way around. They come to scriptures and say, "God, why don't you evaluate me?"
Hey everyone, thanks for watching. We hope that you're blessed by these video messages my husband Jacques is putting out. If so, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you're watching on Facebook, be sure to like and follow. We love you, we're praying for you, and thanking God for his plans and purposes to prosper in your life.